Who did they scan to make the 3D models of the rat catchers? Will Sir Criston be a good hand to the king? How was the fight between the twins different in the book compared to the TV show? We'll be covering these questions and more in this video. Welcome to Square Eyes, a channel where we recap, review and take a sideways look at your favourite TV shows. In this video we're looking at the second episode of Season 2 of House of the Dragon, called Rhaenyra the Cruel. Let's jump straight into the recap. Episode opened in the immediate aftermath of the murder of little Jaehaerys at the end of the last episode. There's chaos in the corridors, and suddenly there are plenty of guards on show, which wasn't the case earlier when the assassins were creeping around the castle. We also get a glimpse of Sir Criston Cole, who's looking a bit shifty after he was in the bed of the Queen Dowager when he should have been on guard duty. Aegon is going berserk and is taking out his frustration on the little model city that his father had spent so long constructing. Aemon looks a bit shifty too when he returns to his room, noticing that the coins he was using to play war games with Sir Criston had been stolen, meaning he knows that the assassins came for him first. Alicent is distraught about the news, and while Otto may also be grieving in his own way, he's also pretty quick to start talking strategy about the best way to respond to this. To him it's like the death of a child is just the latest move in a large game of chess. A small council meeting offers Aegon another chance to let off some steam, with him screaming, shouting and trashing the place. He also has some important questions, such as asking Sir Criston Cole where he was when the murder was taking place. Criston replies that he was in bed, which is technically true, but it wasn't his bed, and he wasn't sleeping, as we can tell by the guilty look we see on Alicent's face during his questioning. Aegon's anger cannot be reasoned with, despite Otto's best attempts, and he's certain that Rhaenyra was the brains behind the assassination. Then Larys turns up with news that Blood has been caught with a child's head in a sack, trying to escape the city. It's a shame that we didn't get to see this scene in a way, because there's no way you can reasonably try and talk your way out of that particular situation. Aegon is keen to go kill Blood himself, but Otto instructs Larys to go torture him and get whatever information he can from him instead. This frustrates Aegon as he feels that his granddad is pumping the brakes and stopping him from expressing himself, a bit like a toddler that doesn't want to eat his vegetables and is sick of the grown-ups telling him what to do. Aegon then turns his attention to the small council members, suggesting that any one of them could have betrayed him and been complicit in the murder. Otto points out that it's possible and they must investigate, but then explains that for their purposes, they need to point the finger of blame at Rhaenyra regardless of the real culprit. Aegon is currently seen as being weak, so blaming his half-sister will turn public opinion against her and make it less likely that she'll be able to gain support for her claim to the throne. I think Aegon can hear the sense in his reasoning, but doesn't like being called weak, and perhaps wanting to show he isn't weak, has another little tantrum, throwing cups around and shouting some more. Otto suggests that a big public funeral will help sway public opinion further, as it will give visual evidence of the brutal attack. It's a pretty grim tactic, but Otto wants to wring every possible advantage from the situation, and sees this as a chance to gain support for their cause. Helaena and Alicent are to be the public face of the funeral, to show the grief that this death has caused. Down in the cells, Lord Larys' reputation must have gone before him, because Blood starts to sing like a canary before the torture instruments have even been unpacked. He tells him that Daemon put it up to him and he worked alongside a rat catcher. He'd most likely have narrated his whole life story to him, he's so willing to give up information. I think this is the most sensible way to approach being tortured. Most people end up squealing in the end anyway, so why not give up the information straight away and have a chance of avoiding all that pain? As the funeral procession makes its way through the city, Larys lets Aegon into the prison cell so he can work out some of his anger on Blood. While the horse and cart is making its way through the city, a wheel gets stuck in a pothole and the crowds gather around Alicent and Helaena, which freaks Helaena out and she seems to have a panic attack. We then cut to Rhaenyra finding out about the murder and the procession of the body through the streets, with her name being loudly associated with the killing. Rhaenyra is stunned by the news and outraged that this has all happened. Everyone else in her council looks at their shoes and tries not to be the one that says anything next, apart from Daemon, who sat there doing a very bad job of trying to look innocent. Somebody called Sir Alfred floats the idea that maybe it was Rhaenyra's doing, which gets him a variety of very hard stares from around the table. Then, despite the fact it's pretty obvious to everyone else, the penny finally drops for Rhaenyra when she looks at Daemon. She looks at him, then does a sort of double take when she realises it was obviously him that sent the assassins. Next we cut to a scene where she's meeting with Daemon in private to directly accuse him of sending Blood and Cheese. Daemon owns up to sending the assassins, but to kill Aemond, and suggests that killing the child was a mistake, though he doesn't seem all that bothered. A bit like if you bought brown bread and you meant to buy white bread. Annoying, but not the end of the world. Rhaenyra sees it another way though, and is absolutely furious that his actions have led to a child being killed and her position being weakened. Daemon insists that he didn't instruct them to kill the child, but we don't know for sure if he's telling the truth. In the last episode, Cheese asked what he should do if Aemond wasn't there, and then the scene ended before we could hear his response. So Daemon gave them some sort of instructions, but we don't know exactly what, though it feels like the kind of thing he would ask them to do. Rhaenyra clearly thinks he did it too, and tells him that she doesn't trust him, which leads to a big argument and Daemon storming off to do his own thing. Maybe he's gone to raise an army at Harrenhal, as it's one of the things he said he thought he should be doing during the argument, and we see him flying off on his dragon in a later scene. Next, Rhaenyra asks Baelor to fly over to King's Landing to keep an eye on things there and see what they're up to, which I don't really understand as a tactic. I'd thought it'd be quite hard to be inconspicuous riding on a dragon, unless you're so high up that you couldn't see anything anyway. Back in King's Landing, Alicent asks Criston Cole if he's told anyone, and he's obviously not one to kiss and tell, as he's kept their activities from the previous night to himself. so Alicent shuts the door and gets in the bath. Now that all her servants are handpicked by the creepy Larys, she's choosing to bathe herself rather than be scrubbed by her underlings. Cole is keeping watch outside while she's inside the room having a bath. He's obviously grappling with something, maybe guilty feelings, or maybe he's just fighting the urge to strip his armour off and jump in the tub with Alicent, as we know that he's not the best at controlling himself around her. We stay with Sir Criston in the next scene, where he picks up Sarek for having a mucky cloak. This was just his opening gambit though, and he quickly shifts into accusation mode and asks Sarek where he was the night before when the assassination took place, which is a stupid line of inquiry, because he was doing his job, protecting the king in the throne room. Criston then shifts gears and starts questioning Eric's loyalty, because his twin brother, Eric, is on Rhaenyra's side, which is all rubbish, and we soon find out this is all just Criston's silly way of manipulating Eric into taking on a mission to strike back at the other side. Cole's big idea is to send the twin knight over to Dragonstone, to sneak in and pretend to be his brother so he can then kill Rhaenyra and stop the war before it's even properly begun. Maybe it's not a stupid idea, I just don't like Criston Cole and want him to fail. Eric isn't keen on the idea, but has got no option to agree to it or risk his loyalty being questioned. Then, in a house of ill repute, Aemon is having a cuddle with an older lady, and we find out that the reason he wasn't around to be assassinated the night before was because he was with the same lady then too. It's quite sad, as despite the fact the woman Aemon is with clearly specialises in other services, he looks like he's only there to cuddle up and have someone to talk to, a sort of mother figure. It's a weird situation, but points towards a lack of love from his real mother that he'd sought out from somewhere else. He confides that he regrets what happened at the end of the last season when his dragon killed Luke. There's one of the new characters in the next scene, Hugh, the Ironmonger, who we saw in the last episode asking for more money from the king. This time he's at home with his wife and child. We find out that there are some shortages of food that are affecting the prices. It sounds like the early days of COVID, with some people stockpiling and some merchants profiteering by jacking up their prices. But rather than a pandemic, this panic buying rush has been provoked by the blockade that is preventing the sea trade from getting through, and the looming prospect of war. We get another new character in the next scene. Alan of Hull gets off his ship and meets with his brother. He had a fairly nothing scene last week where Lord Corlys thanked him for saving his life at sea, and they talked about repairing ships. Now this week he meets his brother, and they talk about how Alan should go to sea with Corlys, and there's some talk about stew. It's another fairly meaningless scene, apart from the fact that we've been gradually shown more and more of this character. Either he's going to become more prominent, or he's just been built up so we can care more about how he gets killed in the next episode. Either is possible in this story world. Next we see Corlys and Rhaenys in bed together, and they're having a chat about Daemon's situation. Corlys is used to playing second fiddle to a wife who is more powerful and influential than him, so thinks Daemon should accept his place in the scheme of things. On the other hand, Rhaenys can sympathise with Daemon more, because she knows how it feels to be passed over for the throne. Then we see Rhaenyra question Mysaria about the goings-on in King's Landing, and she confesses she gave Daemon the names of blood and cheese in exchange for her freedom. When Rhaenyra explains that Daemon has already gone, she understands that he's welched on the deal, and her freedom may now be in question. She's dealt with Daemon long enough to know that this is how he works. She has one of those, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed faces. Mysaria asks Rhaenyra to release her, so she can honour Daemon's promise. She refuses because it might risk her safety. Mysaria explains how badly treated she was by the Hightowers, and therefore she wouldn't betray her. Then it's good news for rats in King's Landing, as Aegon has ordered all the rat catchers to be hung. He'll regret his choice when all the cheese in the city has been gnawed on by the rats. It was a bad idea for other reasons too, as the family and friends of the rat catchers see the hanging bodies and curse King Aegon. This blanket approach might be cruel, but Aegon did get his man, as we see cheese swinging from his neck. This isn't particularly sad, as he was half of a child-murdering assassination team. But then suddenly my heartstrings were pulled when we see the rat-catching dog from last week, loyally sitting under his master's body, letting out a pathetic-sounding whine. Otto is pretty cross about the hanging of the rat-catchers, and gives Aegon a telling off for murdering innocents. After the careful PR stunt of the funeral had built up some sympathy for the royal family, this mass murder will have squandered that feel-good buzz about the place. And, most importantly, Otto doesn't like people doing things without his say-so. Aegon tells his grandfather that he wishes to smell blood, not ink, which is a good line, but it also has the logic of a psychopath. He then brags about how Criston Cole has sent Sir Eric on his one-man attempt to take down Rhaenyra. Otto isn't keen on this idea either, but again, mostly because it's not gone through the correct channels. The dispute culminates in Aegon stripping Otto of his role of Hand of the King and giving the job to Criston Cole instead, which even Sir Criston seemed surprised about. I suspect he mostly got the job by being in the room at the right time. If a chambermaid had been there instead, she might have been given the role. But it's Criston Cole who's got two jobs to juggle now, as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard and Hand to the King. Rhaenyra shows that she's a better person than her husband and uncle when she agrees to free Mysaria, despite the risk that presents to her security. She sends her to Myr, which I think is a place away from this dispute, and in theory she'll not be able to be involved in the coming war, though it seems certain that we'll see this character again, and this moment will either come back to bite Rhaenyra, or her honourable but slightly foolish choice may pay off because she's chosen kindness over fear. As Mysaria has been taken down to her boat, Arik is making his way up to the castle, in full helmet and armour, so he can't be distinguished from his twin. Then there's a bit of cat and mouse as both twins are moving around the castle, and they nearly but not quite bump into each other. It culminates in Eric making his way into Rhaenyra's bedroom and advancing upon her with his sword drawn, only for his twin to burst in and interrupt him. They then have a twin-on-twin sword fight, and it's one of the best sword fights we've seen in this or Game of Thrones, with them obviously being perfectly matched, though it's impossible to tell which one's winning because they're both identical to each other. It ends with one of them getting a sword through the belly, which we then find out is Eric, and Rhaenyra is safe. Eric stabs himself in the stomach, killing himself too, and both twins are out of the picture. He was pretty dinged up from the fight anyway, but I would guess he's killed himself out of the grief from killing his twin. We're then back to King's Landing, where Otto is taking losing his job pretty badly, as he talks it all through with Alicent. She can most likely see how this spins well for her, as Criston Cole isn't all that bright and she can control him, and it's a chance for her to get her father out of the way. While she sympathises with the father, she clearly sees this change as an opportunity for her to advance her own position. While Alicent and Otto are having a father-daughter heart-to-heart, she decides she wants to confess to him about her sins, presumably her carrying on with Criston Cole. Otto, making a rare tactical error, tells that he doesn't want to know about it. While I can understand why he's a bit squeamish about hearing about his daughter's misdeeds, this could have been information that he might have used to his advantage. Then Alicent is moving through the castle, and she comes across Aegon, who is in tears. Rather than offering her son comfort after he's just lost his own son, she turns away from him and leaves him on his own, which is pretty heartless. Instead, she goes back to her own bedroom, and Criston Cole is waiting for her there. She slaps him pretty vigorously a few times, but it turns into kissing, and they're back to getting up some illicit funny business. So while Alicent's talk about feeling like she'd been punished for her sins earlier in the episode hasn't stopped her from sinning again. Also, Sir Criston seems happy to be taking another night off guard duty, the night after he was sleeping on the job. Both of them deserve each other. This episode felt like part 2 of a 2-part opening episode really, as most of the time was spent dealing with the fallout from the blood and cheese events from last episode, which triggered a series of reactions. It wasn't always an easy watch, but it was very well done, and we saw a variety of responses to a tragic death on display. It was a bit like a live-action demonstration of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, as we saw anger from Aegon, and bargaining from Otto, depression from Helena, and a bit of all sorts from Alicent, but mostly guilt, I suppose. I thought Aegon had an interesting episode, as we saw him consumed with rage and desperate to find an outlet for it, beyond his father's model city. His grandfather and Hand to the King denied him his first opportunity to get revenge when Blood was captured, because he was needed for intelligence, but Larys was happy to turn the prisoner over to the young king as soon as was possible, because he recognised that need in him. It's obvious that Larys is taking every opportunity he can to get in the good books of Aegon and become a trusted advisor to him, even if that means letting him murder the odd prisoner along the way. Aegon's impatience to act and frustration at constantly having his wings clipped by dithering old men led to him stripping his grandfather of the role of Hand to the King and passing the little badge to Criston Cole. The way this scene played out, we were obviously meant to think that he was making a terrible mistake, but I think getting rid of his scheming granddad makes perfect sense. It's just he should have probably thought a bit harder about who he gave the job to. If he was hoping he was going to outthink the opposition in the coming war, he may have chosen badly, given the gormless looks that Criston had on his face when he realised he'd been given the second most powerful job in the kingdom. Aegon's reaction to the death of his son was pure rage, but the rest of the reactions we saw were more varied. Alicent and Criston obviously felt guilty about what they did. Otto was quick to move straight into scheming and manipulating the situation to his advantage and winning a PR victory for his family. Aemon seemed more bothered about his own narrow escape than the loss of his nephew, but that's not a huge surprise given he has a bit of a sociopathic edge to him. Helena seemed to have the closest thing to a normal reaction, if such a thing is possible, though the cruel spectacle of the funeral was too much for a fragile disposition, and seeing her break down wasn't nice to see. On the Dragonstone side of the story, I don't think it was meant to be funny how late Rhaenyra was to see that Daemon was behind the assassination, but it sort of played out that way, with everyone around the table not buying how upset she was about the news, and Daemon sat there, pretending that he had nothing to do with it. I don't think we'll ever get the answer to the question about whether he ordered the death of the child if Aemon wasn't around. We'll have to make up our own minds. Personally, I think he probably did, but feel free to put your thoughts in the comments if you have your own theory. Obviously, Rhaenyra doubts him enough not to trust him anymore. I find it interesting that we're getting a few new characters this season that seem to be expanding the story a bit into the lives of ordinary people. Alan's been in both episodes and seems to have been introduced to show the experience of people aboard the ships that are the most likely going to sail into battle. Then we've got Hugh in King's Landing, that's given us a bit of insight into the day-to-day life in the city, with shortages and stockpiling going on. We also saw Aemond with his prostitute, who he seems to have got fairly attached to. These new characters seem to all have a lower social standing than a typical character, which I suspect is so we can get a feel for the impact decisions have on the regular people. Prostitute even says to Aemond, when princes lose their temper, it's others who suffer, which is surely a line that will have relevance later in the season. The main action sequence in this episode came when the two twins set about each other in Rhaenyra's bedroom. This fight was coming the second the two of them joined separate sides at the end of last season, though I would have expected them to have met on the battlefield. Having a twin take the other twin's place without anyone else noticing is the sort of storyline you'd expect in a bad sitcom or a soap opera, but I suppose it worked here as a way for the Hightowers to strike back and try to end the feud before it started. The fact it failed weakens them though, and makes them look a bit silly for trying such a long shot in the first place. I feel like this episode is similar to the first episode in this season, in that it was light on action and relied more on the dramatic scenes between the characters to carry it along. The huge confrontation between Rhaenyra and Daemon was one of the highlights, where two great actors got to chew the scenery for a while. But while there weren't two armies going into war with each other, or dragons setting fire to anyone, there was enough going on to keep me interested all the way through. It feels like the tension is mounting and mounting with every passing scene, and it's going to explode into action any minute. But now I'm happy to enjoy these episodes where each side squabbles with each other and prepares for the confrontation that's to come. However, I hope there's not going to be too much more time to wait before things come to a boiling point. I realise I do sound a bit like Aegon now, and I want to spill blood, not ink. Which is true. These scenes in the last two episodes have been great, full of drama, and have set up the stakes well between the two sides. And now I'm invested into seeing there being a confrontation to decide who should be on the Iron Throne. So I hope we don't have to wait too long before we see some words turning into action. My favourite line this episode came from Aegon when Otto said he wouldn't dare strip him of his role of Hand of the King. And he replied, "I have dared, and I find it stimulating." I thought this was a great answer back to Otto, who had overstepped and Aegon needed to put him back in his box. I'm aware this is the second consecutive week I've chosen Aegon for my favourite line, but he has such great dialogue and he delivers it so well, I'm going to keep on picking him if he carries on like that. The winner and loser from this week's episode are pretty obvious really. The winner has to be Sir Criston Cole, after he somehow managed to land the job of Hand of the King, despite the fact all the chaos in this episode was partly his fault, because he abandoned his post the night before and didn't stop the assassins. He also receives the credit for his idea to send Sir Arryk to murder Rhaenyra, despite the fact it ultimately didn't work. He's the embodiment of failing forward. He's getting things wrong, and it's all working out for him anyway. The problem Sir Criston faces now is that he's been over-promoted, and he's now likely to be found out. He'll make a terrible Hand of the King, as he doesn't have any of the skills required to make a good job of it. So I doubt we're going to see him feature as the winner of any future episodes, which I'm fine with, as he's a pretty unlikable character, and hopefully he's being lifted up now so he can fall harder later on. And the loser this week has to be Otto Hightower, who got sacked by his own grandson from his job as Hand of the King. He has been pretty boring lately though, always talking about being cautious and taking the long view of things, which is incredibly dull for people who like watching sword fights and dragons burning down cities. So I'm not too sad to see him off to scheme somewhere else. I'm sure we'll see him turn up later again in the season. Maybe he'll be on his doorstep in his pants, or maybe he'll be needed for some scheming or other. The fight scene between Arryk and Eric took 3 weeks to choreograph, and only one shot required a stuntman, which is the one where one of them got thrown into a plant pot. The producers didn't want viewers to know which one of the twins was which during the fight, so made sure that each of them sustained the same injuries, so you can't tell them apart even if you slow it down and try and keep track of who's been cut on the leg or who's been slashed on the face. The fight between the twins is taken from George R.R. Martin's books, but it has been changed slightly for the TV series. In the books, it's not clear if Arryk is intending to kill Rhaenyra or her children, and the fight doesn't take place in front of her. Also, Eric doesn't fall on his sword in the book either. They just both die from the wounds they inflict upon each other. So in the book, it's more of a draw rather than one winning and stabbing themselves right after. I think the changes they made for the TV series make it more dramatic, without changing the overall meaning of what went on, so I don't see any problem with any of that. Scenes where the rat catchers are hanging from the city walls used a mixture of real actors and fake bodies, so around half of them are real people in clever harnesses, they're not actually in any danger of being hanged, and the other half are 3D models of real people. One was based on Danny Gulliver, one of the show's producers. I can see the logic of using a mix like this, as real people have the kind of authentic weight and look to them, but the dummies come in models show their skin stretching around their neck and more authentically like they've been hung, because obviously Cheese is the real actor up there, and it's pretty clear that the noose isn't doing any harm to its neck, so with the 3D modelled corpses, you can see a lot more realistic looking stretching and that sort of thing. The actor who plays Sir Criston Cole, Fabian Frankel, has had to limit who can comment on his Instagram posts, because of the amount of harassment he's been receiving from House of the Dragon fans. I'm not a fan of Criston Cole either, but I think some people really need to get a sense of perspective and understand that there's a difference between reality and fiction. If anything, Fabian Frankel needs to be celebrated for being part of creating a character that's so much fun to hate. That takes a lot of skill. I heard stories that Jack Gleeson, who gave up acting after he played Joffrey so well in Game of Thrones, was also harassed by members of the public, but he since insisted that he only had positive interactions with fans, and that had nothing to do with his decision to quit acting. So Sir Criston has reached levels of dislike that even Joffrey didn't manage. The trailer for the next episode gives plenty of clues about what we can expect, so maybe stop the video here if you don't want to have any spoilers about what might happen in the next time out. If you did the word cloud for the dialogue in this trailer, the word war would be the biggest word standing out, as it's all anyone can talk about. So if this isn't the episode where the war starts properly, it's certainly going to take us up to the brink of war by the looks of it, as we see clips of soldiers leaving the city walls and King Aegon talking about wanting to go to war, and Rhaenys talking to Rhaenyra about people not remembering who declared war. There's also an interesting shot of Daemon on his dragon, so we'll get some clues about what he's up to after he flew off in his dragon in this week's episode. There's some discussion about dragons fighting each other too, which my guess is that we'll not actually see any fighting dragons, but there might be some close call or confrontation where someone backs away from a fight with a dragon, because the dialogue we hear is someone warning that dragons fighting each other is really destructive. Thinking more broadly about how the story is progressing this season, We might see a bit more about Aegon's struggle to be taken seriously as a king. Will we see more of the nice guy from episode 1, or the Ratcatcher hanger from episode 2? Given he's got rid of his moderate grandfather as Hand and replaced him with the rage-filled Criston Cole, I suspect those nooses will be needed again before long. It'll also be interesting to see how Rhaenyra keeps her alliances together on her side. Daemon and Rhaenys are powerful allies, but both feel like they've had their claims to the thrones overlooked. That means they may not be 100% loyal to her. I also think schemers like Otto Hightower, Mysaria and Larry Strong are currently a bit on the outside of things, but they tend to be the ones that end up on top because they can twist things to their advantage. So I'd expect all three of these characters to be involved down the line to some extent or another. Whatever happens, I'm really enjoying House of the Dragon, and feel happy to see where it goes. I'm confident that they know what they're doing with this story. After the disappointment of the later seasons of Game of Thrones, it's nice to be back enjoying being in this story world and being fully absorbed in an interesting story. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you did. I'll be back with another House of the Dragon video next week, and subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss it. Goodbye.